Good morning, good day, good afternoon. Samuel, how are you this fine day?
Pretty great. Yeah. Uh, Finally nice here in Montana. So spending a lot of time in the garden.
Awesome. I love hearing
More
that. So that
nice.
clearly it's spring is sprung, I assume, in Montana, and are we hurtling toward a summer weather vibes there yet, or is it you still feeling
For
yeah,
sure. Yeah. It was pretty funny walking around this weekend because everyone in town was so sunburnt after being in just like a snowy environment for the last, you know, 6 months and then got too excited from the sun.
awesome.
It's pretty fun.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I thought I would just before we jump into things, give a couple of updates that are running around in my world. Again, this is Dave Fortson. I'm with a longtime partner of Regen Network Community. We're a validator as Loa Labs and a longtime comms and marketing partner. Honored to always be associated with this fantastic team since 2017. So anyhow, I've got a good sense of what's moving across. I want to actually just take a little trip back briefly. I just came back from Austin for Consensus. Uh, Interesting to see these conferences and their various states during the various market conditions. But anyhow, had a really lovely time in Austin. We went with a few Loa Labs team members. Obviously, we're rolling deep with Regen team representative, in this case, Sarah Baxendale, who was able to who was given time on one of the main stages at Consensus to talk about as one of the projects to watch, which was, I thought, a great honor for Regen. So she had 5 minutes to pitch what's happening in Regen, and just I think a really, I think a timely example of the desire for people to see real world use cases of blockchain that affect human beings or the planet in very material ways. I think given the temperature, if you will, in the world around regulatory scrutiny and people questioning, what's Web3 for and how does it work. So that was really neat to see her up on the big stage in her amazingly green, glittery kicks, which were quite fun. You can see a picture, a great picture of her on stage on the Regen Twitter. So take a look at that. Um, I was also there, with several hats on with Loa Labs, with Regen, and also I had a chance to have a discussion and speak on one of the stages on behalf of BXC, the Blockchain Times Climate Leadership Network, where we had a squad essentially that was looking at the use case of um, uh, companies wanting to engage or upgrade their approach to ESG utilizing Web3 tooling. Again, with the whole focus on really kind of landing another real world use case of Web3 tools to affect something that's happening now. And I think, again, as we've seen, ESG has sometimes pilloried in certain circles as greenwashing. And clearly, it is a major framework for helping guide companies' approach at the same time. And I think there was a fair amount of discussion around standardization of what ESG means relative to designing solutions to ESG issues, to approaching the communication and reporting to consumers and to regulatory bodies. There's a lot of discussion around those topics in particular, and how Web3 tools and blockchain can support higher integrity approach to ESG, which I thought was a really interesting topic. We actually broke out into working groups, ended up being close to a 2 hour engagement. And that was exciting, an exciting discussion with a lot of really interesting people who showed up, both in the Web 2 and Web 3 space. And I'd say just more broadly that consensus was, you know, consensus after a number of crypto conferences, probably one of my least favorites for what happens on the inside of the convention center. Frankly, a little bit on the generic side. And certainly in a bear market, I think there was and in regulatory hostile regulatory climate, I think there was a lot of trepidation, and at the same time, uh, to be clear, the growth is still significant, and I think Web3 is not going anywhere. But I think it was a little bit tempered. But on the outside, we had a chance to go to the refi house. Had great meetings with a number of players in the kind of broader space of regenerative finance, and generally left with a fair amount of optimism again that the builders are building, and the use of blockchain, particularly to building regenerative finance, green money Legos and Rails for valuing ecological assets and ecological services, is alive and well. So that was something I was hoping to share, and just as a big takeaway that I have, that still, despite bear market conditions, incredibly bullish on Web3 and blockchain for ESG, refi, and beyond. So, quick report from Consensus. Happy to answer any questions if you have them, but that was a quick takeaway. So, with that said and that report done, I wanted to bring us to the topic at hand. Sam, friend and colleague, is going to dig into credit classes. What are they? How do they work? Why are they important? How are they governed? What is kind of picking apart, understanding the full stack of systems and structures in order to originate carbon asset or natural capital assets or ecological credits, and bring them to market in a way that ensures as much transparency, integrity, uh, and just quality as possible. It requires a bunch of pieces that people, I think, don't understand probably as clearly as they should, particularly as it relates to how Regen has really taken a holistic approach to engaging the full stack credit origination system. So I'm excited to dig into this a little bit more. Sam, I was wondering if you just wanted to maybe start by just bringing us, giving us a 30,000-foot view. Where what do credit classes fit? What are they, and where do they fit into a full stack credit origination system? Just help give us place credit classes in the on the map, by giving people some other milestones within that map.
Yeah, totally. And maybe before I answer, I just wanted to make a comment on your
Yes,
Consensus
please.
share back around ESGs, and I'm really excited to hear that there is conversation around how to upgrade the standards for claiming SDGs, especially as more regulatory pressure on doing that. And I see Sophie in the audience, and I know that she's also thought a little bit about this. But it's a nice segue into thinking about, governance, and are we setting these standards? How are we describing different types of taxonomies and ontologies to make it really clear what people are doing, and adhering to these more international kind of pushes. So really cool to hear that. And then also just to the audience, I do want to encourage folks to request to speak at any point in time. If it's kind of relevant in the first half of this conversation, when we're going to be a little bit more structured around credit classes and governance, and then in the second half, if you have topics that you want to come on and talk about, I would love to invite that, because I'd like it to be a little bit less me talking and more audience members engaging and asking questions and digging in. So with that, I'll move on to credit classes. And I think maybe to start this kind of framing that the 10,000-foot level, it would be nice to just briefly describe how traditional ecosystem service registries work, and how Regen is a little bit different from that. So typically in more centralized ecosystem service registries, I would largely break down the functions that they do into three separate things. One is that they help develop methodologies and standards. The second is that they act as an enforcement body to assure that projects registered under those methodologies and standards are adhering to kind of the rules that were outlined in those documents. In doing so, they're partnering with validation verification bodies and other trusted third-party organizations to help ensure kind of enforcement, which might be a little bit of a strong word, but essentially that's the function that they serve. And then the third is a database, so the registry as the digital ledger itself. And so, typically centralized organizations manage all three of these things, and they often release standards that outline the rules and requirements for all projects around the world or within a specific region. So whether or not you're running a avoided peatland project, an avoided deforestation project, a reforestation project, a soil carbon project, you typically are following some sort of meta standard, as well as a practice-specific methodology. And so, in thinking about the design of credit classes, one thing that we were really digging into early on is, do these kind of like global approaches make sense? Is it too top down? Is it too difficult for methodology and standards creators to make global, kind of standards? And what we realized, especially in talking to many partners, is it's a lot easier to start locally. And so getting into credit classes, we, in developing the eco credit module, created this concept of a credit class, which from a technical perspective, I would describe as a closed container um, for programs or organizations to issue credits of a specific credit type that fall within a specific bioregion or follow a specific land management practice. And why we thought that was really important is that we're kind of giving organizations the chance to develop methodologies that are more locally specific to their needs, while allowing for a technical system that can host many different credit standards in different parts of the world with different types of uncertainty and rigor, all on the same digital ledger. And so getting into kind of how we use credit classes, there's three main ways that they're used, and I'm going to speak to all three and then really highlight the first two. So the first one is people using credit classes to develop a specific methodology for a land management practice that falls within our native Regen Registry Program Guide. And so typically, that could be biochar production in the Pacific Northwest. It could be rotational grazing in Argentina. It could be avoided deforestation in, Brazil. And so all of these organizations are developing methodologies. They're working with us in our program guide to kind of develop a standard that fits those needs for their specific region. The second way that they're being used is with organizations that are actually have developed their own protocol and standard. And so in thinking about how they want to be running projects, they thought it made more sense to develop their own program guide and their own standard for things like biodiversity credits or soil carbon credits. And the kind of major difference between the first two is that in contrast to us, the Regen Registry team playing a little bit more heavy hand in kind of ensuring that they're following our program guide. We're essentially making sure that they're using their own in the way that they said they would. And then the third type of credit class that we see is kind of a vehicle to tokenize credits from other registries. When I say registry, I'm kind of referring to credits issued on another database. And so, that could be credits that are tokenized from Vera or Gold Standard, like we've seen Toucan do and Klima do. But then also, we can use credit classes to tokenize credits or migrate credits from other blockchains. So, in building this bridge with Toucan, even though they, had their own tokenization process from Vera, we actually built another credit class so they can migrate their credits from their registry to our registry in kind of this closed container, like I was saying. And I think that third one's really important to highlight, especially as there are many registries emerging out there. We have Pro Earth is kind of becoming the big fifth registry alongside Vera and Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, and CAR. But then there's tons of smaller ones all over the world that are doing really exciting work and kind of have their own registry structure. And so inviting the ability to kind of migrate between databases, expand markets is really important. But primarily we're focused on those first two. So how can we support communities to develop bioregionally specific or practice specific credit classes that fall under our standard or a standard that they created?
So Sam, on the credit class, and again, that's the fair amount to unpack there. On really all three of those points. But I'm trying to figure out how to communicate this. So, are the credit class? I guess maybe define help us understand how to define who originates the a credit class. Like, what is the to help us get to where Regen Registry and somebody like you shows up in a process. So can you take us through, the development of a credit class today, or one that's, let's say, one that's active at the moment, and just
Yeah.
walk us through kind of the milestones and the players and where they're participating in that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is kind of where we're starting to get into governance. So as I share about this, I'm just sharing kind of my opinions on how we could start to implement different forms of governance, or where we should be implementing community decision making in the process. And so I would just encourage folks to hold that in the back of their mind as they listen to me talk. And so I to start, I'll just say, from a technical perspective, the only way that credit classes can be created on Regen Ledger at the moment is if you apply to become a credit class creator. So the ability to create new credit classes on chain is gated by token governance. So you have to create a proposal to the community and say, I want to become a credit class creator. Here's why I want to do it. Here are essentially kind of my credentials and how I'm going to use this in good practice. And if they vote yes, then you have the ability to create as many credit classes as you want. So far, the only organization that has applied for the credit class creator address permissions is Regen Registry. And so right now, for all the organizations we're working with, these organizations, for all three possibilities, are going through Regen Registry and the Regen Registry team to create credit classes. And so typically what those kind of relationships look like is, we'll connect with an organization, and maybe I'll use Colson Carbon Trust as an example because, I really love their project. Oh, I also see Howard in the audience. And so, typically what that looks like is kind of we start to understand kind of like what their project is, what their initiatives is, how they want to use this credit class. And then we identify, are there methodologies out there that fit your needs? Are there methodologies that don't fit your needs? Do you want to develop your own methodology and credit standard? Or do you want to use an existing methodology and create your own kind of credit standard? And so in the example with Colson Carbon Trust, they wanted to develop a crediting program for the production of biochar. So carbon being captured in, the pyrolysis. So when biochar is created, you're capturing carbon and then you're reapplying it on soils, or in their case, also kind of the forest bed, and mixing it in with the duff and the litter of the forest to kind of help boost the soil health. And in Colson Carbon Trust example, they used a Vera methodology that came out last year. And they decided that they wanted to use, kind of our program guide, which outlines some kind of, more programmatic rules and requirements for credit issuance, management of buffer pools, project registration, project termination, things like that. And so, in doing that, we help them kind of identify the methodology they want to use. They developed an appendix for their specific region, and then they went through and developed, this credit class document, which essentially outlined specifically how they want their projects to be run. So, during project registration, what are the steps involved? When thinking about permanence periods, how long is the permanence period? How are buffer pools and permanence pools going to be reconciled at the end of that period? And so we kind of went through this process of developing, this credit class document, which outlines, bioregionally specific and practice specific rules and requirements. And kind of we're at the final stage of finalizing that. And so the next step, once that's approved, is, we'll create a credit class on chain, and then, I'll probably pause here. But, after that, we can get into, who is managing that credit class. Is it Regen Registry? Is it Colson Carbon Trust? Is it a combination of the two? Do we invite other community members in to help kind of govern and manage the decision making processes associated with this credit class? But yeah, I'll kind of pause there and see.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Maybe somewhat of a related question. I'm trying, again, in my mind, painting this visual map of when, the word I'm kind of searching for, I'm drawn to, is fungibility. Like the fungibility of a credit class or the fungibility of a methodology. And it feels like there's like a little bit of a Russian doll nesting of like all of these terms and what they represent. But maybe sticking to the credit class side, what is the like under the current guise where R&D is authorized to create credit classes? What's the incentive to adopt credit classes that may have been produced by other registries? And when does it make sense to originate a new credit class, that maybe has very specific characteristics around like a bioregion or a very specific product that may not exist? Like, how do you like weigh or engage in thinking about how to approach that issue, like strategically, where I'm sure there's other my assumption is, and you can maybe push back on this, that there are other biochar credit classes that have been created in some other registry, but there's something obviously unique, maybe place based or methodology based around this particular around Colson that essentially inspired or instigated Regen to develop a unique credit class around this. Can you just like speak to that concept so people, I
Yeah.
think, can wrap their heads around that a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think that there are kind of many different motives for why they would want to use credit classes or really work with Regen Registry or use some of our tech. I think from a obviously from a technical perspective, there's a lot of kind of appeal in adopting digital ledger technologies for tracking claims on ecological state as we kind of as really this climate action space explodes, and there's more and more push both from private industries and nation states to really ramp up the amount of nature-based solutions and kind of credit systems and payment-free ecosystem service programs out there. And so, I think that there's a lot of organizations we work with that really value this idea of, storing it on a data structure that is, not fully mutable, but pretty darn close to it. And being able to essentially create a digital audit trail of, the claims that were made. So, who made the decisions, how are those decisions made, what was the data used, how are the methodologies and standards being evolved, how are the credits being issued, who owns them, so on and so forth.
And so, Sam, just
Yeah.
so I understand, just to interject, are you implying that part of the uniqueness of this particular credit class is tied to the technology stack, which may make it require some level of customization to Regen Registry in this case versus a more generic, biochar, some other credit
Yeah,
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, and I think kind of extending beyond just the idea of credit classes. Regen really has built an amazing tech stack, and I would love to give a shout out to Ryan Christopherson and the Ledger team for all the work that they've done there. Because in creating these credit classes, there really is the ability to customize the data structures and the amount of information you're storing in a publicly and digital and transparent way. And so, I think that that's a very important theme. Speaking to your original question as well, I think that the other main thing is, being able to kind of have more tight control around governance and being directly involved with the standards that you're using and the standards that you're creating. I'm not by any means, kind of like bashing on legacy registries because I think that they've done really amazing work. But in those models, as a user of those standards and of the registry, you don't really have as much opportunity to weigh in on updating the standards, how projects are managed and approved, and if there's a deviation, what the process is to kind of approve that. And so, in creating credit classes, communities are really able to kind of govern the way that credit class is used, how the standards created, and I think that Colshan has really been thinking about that in creating a regionally specific credit class with the intention of bringing community members in to help manage that. So not just managing the standards and the production of biochar, but also selling credits in farmers markets or setting up some sort of trust. And I see that Howard just hopped on the stage. I'd be curious, Howard, if you want to share about your thoughts on this question and what really the appeal is to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And I appreciate the framework you put around the process. Having been involved in, I guess, for going on a year now, it's nice to have it laid out in the way you did. And actually, the last couple comments got to the point I wanted to make by raising my hand, and that's to say that in its in its origin and design, Colshan Carbon Trust is place-based to the four counties in Northwest Washington along the Salish Sea. And what we intend is to connect people with opportunities for collaborative natural climate solutions, and biochar being the first uh, pilot project we've undertaken. And the essence of it is to have a trusted and neutral platform that will recognize, certify the credits. So when we market them locally, when we take them to some NGOs that are trying to go net zero, or some other local businesses and institutions, it's essential that the credits we offer have the certification and the verifications that come from being registered and being subject to and transparent and consistent methodology. So it really is to give the right, um, I don't call it tone, but to be able to go to market with something other than the uh, the voluntary carbon markets for offsets that have received some negative attention, and that's why the credit class is important to us, is to go to market locally with the credibility of a platform that'll certify and verify that this has been done according to standards.
And Howard, I remember last, Regenerati News Hour, a few weeks ago, you had some, you kind of had a question at the end there that we didn't really have too much time for, around kind of your plans to start to integrate, credit sales and kind of the ownership of credits to, like within the community there. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that or would want to share anything that you've been thinking about.
Well, thanks for asking, Sam. And it's something that's still in the early stages, but we're trying to build a partnership with an agricultural uh, co-op, essentially a food hub that has about 50 to 60 small farmers as members, and they go to market. What we're trying to do in that channel is a go-to-market strategy that will co-market food and carbon credits, so that we'll have eco credits to be able to inset the footprint of the food production. And we're hoping that kind of co-marketing of carbon with the source of the emissions is a way to engage people in a day-to-day way to consider carbon credits as a purchase they make along with other necessities. So that's early stage development. In fact, I'm working on a presentation to the board now to try to frame all this up. But it's the kind of backbone that the Regen Registry allows in this credit class will recognize for initially biochar, subsequently regenerative agriculture practices that we're hoping will propel this idea forward.
Nice. I really like that. Kind of framing, and one of the personal projects, or at least ideas at this stage, that I've really been interested in is engaging people in kind of local farmers markets, especially the one here in Bozeman, which is really small and the community is very engaged, and learning more about regenerative agriculture and climate initiatives, and thinking about like how can we create learning programs, people can get vouchers to participate in learning about regenerative agriculture, or going and visiting a farm and helping out there. And so I personally really appreciate just kind of hearing about your model to engage local communities, because I think it's almost easier to engage these your community in a project that you're running right next to it, because they have a lot more kind of sense of what you're doing, and desire to contribute, which is really awesome. So excited to hear the work you're
Yeah,
doing.
and I just add one tagline to it. We're hoping that by knowing your carbon credit producer, that there'll be trust built into the relationship, which is a big challenge overcoming the distrust that's been um, overlaying on the larger, more distant markets.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Howard, for jumping up and sharing more about that. I actually wanted to start picking apart in this latter 15, 20 minutes or so. Sam, it feels like one of probably the underappreciated and maybe least understood aspects of Regen's approach to credit class development, and really to the full ecological asset origination stack, is governance. And that arguably this could be one of the more differentiating, influential, and potentially like a way of really realigning how people think, or how the industry, the voluntary carbon market, and broader ecological asset market thinks about um, developing a more just, more high integrity approach to ecological asset development. Could you kind of speak to, again, maybe more, help us understand why this may or may not, or what the issues are in the current kind of legacy markets or legacy registries, that when Regen originated their own idea of how to approach this in a different way, how governance was one of the key factors, and why. And then maybe we can start to unpack, kind of some different scenarios around what is possible and what is new and different when we think about governance possibilities, and why that is important to the development of ecological assets.
Mm-hmm. Where to start? Yeah, the kind of first thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is a conversation I had with Gregory Landua, the founder of Regen, around kind of the way that historical or the current registries for voluntary carbon markets have been set up, where 20 years ago it was really there was a lot of emphasis on the demand side of things. So essentially, ensuring that in creating rigorous and scientifically sound carbon credits, that they're meeting the needs of the buyers, and assuring that essentially that they're having a safe investment as they're offsetting their credits. And I think that that's definitely really important. But I think one thing that happened as a result of that is, the supply side, the people on the ground, we're definitely brought into those conversations, but there is more emphasis on how do we create systems that meet kind of corporate needs for their emission reductions through offsetting. And in thinking about the foundation of the Regen network, is we really want to place the decision making power in the hands of the scientists, the land stewards, the farmers, as well as the buyers. I think that everyone really needs to have a voice in these kind of these crediting programs, but historically there hasn't been as much opportunity for people on the ground to weigh in, or for scientists to weigh in. And especially because these registries have become so massive, that they're massively overloaded right now. Vera has a major backlog. It's really hard to engage and even get kind of a project registered, let alone updating a standard. And so when we were thinking about governance, we were really thinking about how can we ensure that the people most affected by the problems and that are going to be implementing land management practices are having a voice and do have the ability to weigh in on how standards are created, how credits are sold, things like that. I see Sophia just hopped on. You want to speak to some of that?
Sophia, welcome to the stage. Nice to have you, a fellow 805 Santa Barbarian. How are you hearing this conversation? What's showing up?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think the one thing I wanted to add to this conversation is I'm a grad student at UCSB, and I've been working a lot with folks on the ground doing this farming, so a lot of regenerative agriculture farmers. And we, as part of my thesis, were looking at the comparison between a bunch of different of these verifications or certifications, and kind of based on Sam's conversation about really looking at the supply side rather than the demand side. And we found that a lot of these certifications or verifications, they're measuring the standardization across them is wide ranging and really limiting. And we looked at all the indicators that they were measuring, and it was like over 170, but only 3 of them overlapped between, the 4 certifications we looked at. And so the one thing I just wanted to add to this conversation is I think the credit class approach that Regen has built provides more, I guess, it allows the folks on the ground who are seeing the actual changes and seeing the changes in ecological state and know what needs to be monitored for their local ecosystem. It really puts the power back into their hands in the development of these methodologies and credit classes, which I think really flips the script. And it's a conversation, yeah, I've had with so many land stewards that are just tired of jumping through the hoops and figuring out how to fit within the standards that have been set by these large organizations. So yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that the credit class approach really opens the door and flips the script to a lot of the problems they've been facing in this space for a while.
Well, Sam and Sophia, for both of you, can you practically speak to, and let's with the understanding that the, let's say, calibrated approach to governance with this new framework that Regen is bringing forward is, I think, in development, as I understand it. It's not fully polished, and frankly, it sounds like it could be unique to each credit class. But how and where does actually governance show up? I mean, is this like a who decides what the governance look like? Is it could it be the farmers, or is it the project? Is it a mix of project developers and farmers? Who convenes the group? Where do they show up? And when do they assert their influence, or to some degree sovereignty, over that credit class? And how does that end up uh, impacting or affecting the credits that are being produced? And on a related note, what problems does it help us avoid that may be present in legacy markets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I can chime in, and then I'd love to hear Sophia give her perspective. So, I do just want to say that, we talk a lot about governance, but we're just really getting to the point where we're thinking about integrating governance into, at least from an on-chain perspective, into kind of our design process. Historically, in developing these methodologies and approving these credit classes, there was, like governance was at play, but it wasn't necessarily tracked. We're meeting with these project developers and methodology creators over Zoom calls, and essentially helping co-create these standards. And I would say our team is really acting as a support system, and so we're not saying yeah, you can or can't do this, but more providing recommendations based off of our experience and our understanding of kind of where the market is, where we might want to push it a little bit, and kind of be at that bleeding edge where we want to adhere to kind of more traditional standards to ensure successful sales. And so a lot of this has been kind of done off chain, but finally we're getting to a place where we're live. We're finishing up the interfaces for it so people could actually use this outside of just using the command line. And so I think that this is really the right time for us to really be digging into these conversations and talking about how do we want to be setting up these governance frameworks, who should be involved, how do we decide who should be involved, and starting to track some of this kind of on chain. And I think for me, what I would like to see happen, even in the short term, is for the Regen Registry team just to have a credit class creator address and a methodology approval address. Just tracks our internal decision making on whether or not it meets our standards, and we pass it on to expert review. Because I think that the first step here is just tracking what decisions are being made, even if there's 5 people in those decisions, just to have kind of that transparency, because it gives, people the opportunity to say, hey, we actually think otherwise, and we see that you made this decision, and here's your justification. We'd like to propose something different. But yeah, I think, I would love to hear kind of what Sophia's thinking about it, or how Howard's thinking about it. Because, I would say a lot of the work we do are with organizations representing land stewards. Obviously, we interact with a lot of land stewards as well. But I think our best success is working with organizations that are kind of acting as hubs for many voices.
Yeah, I could just add to that really briefly. And I think one thing that really stood out to me in, having some of these conversations when I was still at Regen and then now working more on the ground with land stewards is the localization of a lot of this work, because the rigidity of some of these previous methods or approaches or credits was so wide reaching. And I think allowing these to be developed more at the local level is so different from a lot of the things happening in the space right now, because you can really look at the actual change in ecologic state in the local region, which again increases oftentimes the accuracy of the metrics, because you're not kind of fitting your approach into a specific box that has already been created by somebody else. So yeah, I think decreasing the rigidity and starting at the more local level and working up is also just something I wanted to add there.
Yeah. And I want to endorse all that and just add the fact it's a network is a very essential element of having the right kind of relationship.
I have a question, Sam or Sophia. In a lot of times when we're talking blockchain, and I'd say particularly where we're building, there's a desire for modularity, right? So around creating modules that are being able to be utilized by other parties in kind of an open source framework. I'm curious, and again, I don't even know if this is a valid question, but with what Howard is doing and your team on the development of the carbon or of the credit class around biochar, or even how we think about governance, like how modular are these new frameworks that are being built, such that, let's assume 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, there are thousands, right? Because we're decentralizing. The goal is to decentralize the origination of ecological credits to quickly advance and better environmental behaviors or ecological behaviors as it relates to humans and how they steward land. So in order to do that, we need information that can be quickly replicated, consumed, and standardized. What does that look like for within Regen Registry and within credit class development or governance? I'd be curious just to get any kind of theoretical, how much of this is transferable to somebody else who may not pick up everything that you did with biochar, this class, or what governance look like for a particular class. Is it transferable? Is it modular, or is it something to be spun up and originated every time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that in this is it's an interesting question, because Sophia just left, but Sophia and I kind of actually really battled with this question early on, as well as Giselle. I see Giselle's out there. We're originally we were thinking, we'll create global standards like all the other registries do, and kind of really very quickly realized that making a standard that works in the Pacific Northwest and in South America and all these other places is relatively difficult. And so what we've been encouraging is for people to really do kind of their upfront research of, is there something out there that fits your needs? If so, you should use it. And if not, develop your own. And I think, I personally would encourage folks to, kind of do that research. And if you have to develop your own, do it. But my hope is that as we get more and more credit classes and more visibility, and Regen Network becomes a little bit more on the map, people can start to find commonalities between different methodologies, applications of them, different credit classes, and start to reuse those rather than kind of duplicating efforts. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of a mix. We have a lot of credit classes that are pretty regionally specific, but we also have some that are being developed, and then in talking to a new organization, we kind of tell them about it, and they're really excited. And some small tweaks would adapt it perfectly to their use case, or it's kind of just off the shelf reusable. And so the hope is that over time less will be created, but I think in the shorter term it's totally okay, and it's great if people want to spin up their own, because oftentimes you can do it a lot quicker. It's easier to develop a methodology and credit class and crediting program for a specific set of pilot projects in your area, as opposed to thinking about, okay, this makes sense here, but in this other region on the other side of the world, it might not work as well. And then you're just kind of spending more time on thinking about how to create this more meta standard. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I've been thinking about it.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Welcome, Timo, to the stage. Nice to have you here. Our friends over at Basin. Timo, what's on your mind?
Thanks, everybody. Good to be here. Just going back through my memory of the last 2 or 3 years and watching, Regen Network evolve. I just really want to echo that I believe in what Regen is building. I believe in the science-based approach. I believe in the community and the open dialogue. It's not about winning and losing, but I really think Regen is not getting the credit it deserves in terms of the refi space and even the greater corporate registry and climate space. So I just want to really harp on that I still believe in what Regen is building, and I think time will tell on that. Specifically, related to some of the tweets I sent out this morning. Yesterday, Pollination and the Task Force for Nature Markets released their report titled Biodiversity Credit Markets, the role of law, regulation, and policy. And so, like, I love obviously the regen approach of like, I go back to biodiversity or diversity of like methodologies and credit classes and creators and a local first approach. But I also think we really need to take a fungibility type approach of like, hey, will corporates accept it? Will governments accept it? So like, how can the credit classes be more fungible? And so along those lines, I really think we need to open up some discussions around tried and true, or emerging natural capital accounting frameworks, like what the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures is doing. The White House is using SIA, and so is TNFD on the SEEA approach. So I really think we need to kind of like use what the corporates and policy and WEF and and so I guess I wanted to just ask, like, who's doing that? I mean, Basin, we're pretty far along in doing that, but so one, natural capital accounting frameworks, two, land use covers. What I think there's some fungibility approaches we can apply across the globe in terms of that. It doesn't all have to be necessarily bioregion or ecoregion. It can actually be biome or land cover. And then thirdly, just ecosystem service values. Ned's work on, just the regen work in general on the stewardship or practice-based approach, a year ago really opened up a lot of thinking for us at Basin, and it's going to be incorporated in our methodology. So just those three things. Anyone who wants to nerd out on accounting approaches, units of value, and land covers, I just want to flag that I really want to dig in on that.
Oops, can I unmute? Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I certainly agree. I mean, I think this is also kind of getting back to my earlier point about, I talked about a little bit, the demand side helping build these markets, and then, placing emphasis on the supply side. But I think that these international frameworks are very, very important to be thinking about and taking into consideration as we're developing these systems, because there's a lot of amazing work being done there. And as kind of, international regulatory markets start to emerge, adopting these standards, being aware, incorporating them in is pretty crucial. And yeah, I'm curious, have in your work, Timo, have you thought about designing Basin with this kind of stuff in mind? Are you how are you striking the balance between emerging international standards and frameworks and kind of market thinking with the more localization approach that you're taking?
So for me, it's Ned had that quote, the Leopold quote about what's economically expedient. It's also what's morally right and ethically right, but what's economically expedient. So if we look at the race we're up against with 2030 or this imaginary deadline of 2050, it's kind of like what's going to work now and what can people adopt and trust. And I think we've run into some of that in the carbon markets where corporates only want Vera or only want ACR, or even Puro, right? I think they're starting to adopt it, but it's not Vera. So it's kind of the same thing I feel like here with biodiversity and ecological assets. It's like, what will the buyers, that demand side, accept? And so to me, it's kind of like looking at the approach we're taking at Basin is the banks, the insurance companies, the governments, the corporations, like, what are they going to accept? What do they want? And what can they, what can be justified, but what also is economically expedient, where we can do it quicker and faster. So that's the approach we're taking.
Mm. And is it, have you, I guess, and feel free not to answer this if it's a little bit more sensitive, but my question is kind of like, what are you finding? Is it, are you finding that kind of one approach makes more sense? Are there certain ways of framing these things or talking about them with, kind of banks and the investor side of, the kind of credit pipeline that have been more successful than others?
I think like, we've done a lot of work on like stacking versus bundling of ecosystem services. Like, I think there's definitely a market, or there's going to be markets for individual layers in the stack, like a pollination credit or an erosion credit or a water quality credit. But we're taking this holistic bundling approach of like more focused on like existence value of like what actually exists in an ecosystem or in a land cover, and then starting to give credit, like when we're talking about our credit class that we're designing, that I hope to submit here to you guys here in maybe a few weeks. It's like what's already existing and how does it compare to a pristine, you know, like wetland or pristine mangrove uh, setting, or estuary wetlands. It's like what's actually existing, and starting to give people credit for that, and then improvement, like, so that's the baseline, and then improvement over time is the outcome based approach. So we're taking a three-prong approach. Is one is real estate, two is existing, and three is outcome. So I think people could build on what we're trying to just give people credit for, or like trying to create a market for, well, hey, this wetlands does actually provide $15,000 of value per acre per year to society, and who's willing to pay stewardship. This goes back to that stewardship approach. So we could I'm happy. I'm open all the time to talk about it. I know we're running up against the hour here, but for us, it's really coming down to per hectare or per acre per year, and we have basically 4,000 studies, several different databases that we're using to quantify those numbers, those stacked stack units into a bundle based value of it goes back to that question of what's a unit of biodiversity, what's a unit of pollination. And so for us, it's become spatial and temporal of like, here's land cover, and here's a unit of time, and here's a dollar value. Everyone understands dollars, so that's where we're at, Sam.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing, and I'm really excited to see your work when you submit it, and excited for continued conversations around this. Dave, do you want to close this out?
Yeah. Thank you, Timo. Thank you, Howard. Really appreciate it. And Sam, your fountain of knowledge, and I really appreciate you unveiling the hard work of the entire R&D team, who are, I think, to Timo's point, often working on things that people, I think, I don't know if underappreciate, but maybe it's just a matter of like being able to really understand and distill this bigger vision that Regen is helping execute in its community. So lots of deep respect, I think, on all sides for the standard that Regen's setting here, and ideally is helping set an example for many of the other Web3 registry players that are starting to emerge, and credit originators. It's an exciting time, and I think Regen continues to be a vanguard on that side of things. So with that said, we're going to tie up here, everyone. It is Thursday. We are at the top of the Regenerati News Hour. We'll be back again with you in 2 weeks. Just a reminder, we have our community call every other week. So next week, community call, it's far more driven by community dialogue and some insider updates of that the only insider if you're not wanting to come, but otherwise they're open to really the entire Regen community to come drop in and have a Zoom-based conversation about what's happening on the ground within the Regen network development team and beyond. So either way, thanks again, everybody. Have a great week. Get outside, touch grass, touch tree, touch flower, and enjoy each other. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Lovely. Thank you.